Thank you, Andy. Thanks to the panelists. Great job. We are going to share your questions. There are many questions that we weren't able to get to, but we'll share those with the researchers, and they are eager to get your feedback. So please, they're accessible through the blog series, and we'd love to hear more from you. Now I'd like to invite Claire Kramer-Mills up and her panel. We're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to start talking a little bit more about interventions and policies that we think can combat income inequality. We've noticed from your questions already that there's a hunger in this group to start talking about whether it's apprenticeship programs or other sort of job preparation programs and education programs that kind of level the playing field in the job market, or investment into low-income neighborhoods through things like opportunity zones or investment tax credits or other sources of capital. We're already getting plenty of those questions from you, so thank you for that. And all right, we've got an hour with Claire and her panel. We'll turn it over to you, Claire.
Well, thank you so much, David. And hopefully we will not have, we'll contain our microphones. I'm Claire Kramer-Mills. I'm from the bank's community development team. And I'm really pleased to be here today to really talk about expanding opportunity in America and really broadening life chances for more of the American population. So I think that that's sort of the bridge between the research panel and this illustrious panel that I have assembled with me. So I'm going to do a brief introduction so you have some familiarity of who's sitting up here. And when I ask the first question, I will ask each of the panelists to give maybe a one-sentence description of their organization and their role, so that you can kind of situate them and their expertise. There are more extensive bios in your packet, so please take a look. These folks are pretty special. They have deep expertise, and I want you to really take it all in. So. I will use the standard Fed disclaimer that the views I express are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. So with that said, to my right is David Williams from Opportunity Insights. To his left is Marisa Munoz from Young Invincibles, and to my left is Martha Ross from the Brookings Institution. So to kick us all off, I mean, I think fundamentally, we are citizens in this democracy, and we are citizens in this economy. And so all of us come to the study of inequality from a very human lens, actually. And so the first question is, for the panelists, is why do you work in this realm? What has attracted you to the work that you do and the focus that you have? So David, if you could kick off.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Just also, I thought that the Fed was going to have to take on any ideas that I espoused here, so I'm sad that you're discounting everything or not accepting it. But yeah, so I work at Opportunity Insights. We're a research and policy lab based at Harvard University, founded by Dr. Raj Shetty and his collaborators at Harvard and Brown. But I'm not an economist by training. I'm actually a recovering lawyer. But most recently, I served in my hometown in Detroit, Michigan. So I served in the mayor's office there, working on issues of economic development. But as many of you might know, Detroit's a city that has struggled mightily over the past 50 years. But actually in the past 15 years, 1 in 3 homes was lost through tax foreclosure, right? So tens of thousands of families and children who lost the roof over their head. So a place where we were working on helping rebuild the physical infrastructure of the city. And we saw progress, right, with working with the philanthropic community, corporate community, government, private sector, started to see progress, started to see investment coming back into our neighborhoods. But I think a question that was always at the back of my mind was, as we're seeing this progress happening, as we're seeing good things happening, are we really changing the life outcomes of the most vulnerable families and their children? And to be candid, we didn't really have the data to know if we were doing that or not. And so something we do at Opportunity Insights is we use research, we use big data to help understand those issues, to understand the impact of neighborhoods, of programs, and of policies, to hopefully help make sure that all the work we're doing can be as impactful and transformational as possible.
Hello. Hi, my name is Marisa Munoz, and I am the Northeast Regional Director for the Young Invincibles. We are a not-for-profit policy advocacy organization that really works to amplify the voices of young adults ages 18 to 34 in the political process. As such, we focus on 4 key issue areas, higher education being one of them, workforce development, healthcare access, and civic engagement. What really drives my work, I am not an economist by trade as well. My work has been in the public sector as well as government for most of my life. I see this issue and all of the issues that I've worked in, more particularly in higher education, as really a civil rights issue. As a Latina, I recognize that Latinos and African Americans have the lowest degrees, right, of college attainment. And what does it mean for them when they graduate to get a good paying job? And so my work is really to help increase those opportunities for young adults, especially young adults of color across New York City and New York State.
I'm Martha Ross with the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. And Brookings is a think tank in DC, and the Metro program focuses on cities and regions to help them become economically competitive and socially inclusive. And I think the way I came to this goes back farther. I think about my mom, who was on the school board, and our school system was desegregated when I was in elementary school. So as a 4th grader, I was on a bus riding up the highway to Wilmington, Delaware. Going from my predominantly white school to a school in a predominantly black neighborhood that was kind of a tough neighborhood. And it's not that I was a particularly precocious 9-year-old, that I had deep reflections on it, but it was so stark. The differences were so stark in neighborhood, in the school facilities, and just over time, as I have worked more on these kinds of issues, I've reflected on that and thought how that memory sort of started, how that experience sort of started me thinking along a certain line.
Thank you all. I'll just say for my part, I'm sitting here, and I have the privilege of sitting here because my grandmother, who grew up in rural Ohio and was, I guess, identified as relatively precocious, was sent away from her family to move to the greater New York area, and was given an opportunity to have education. And I think that so much of the individual cases of opportunity are really tied to someone seeing a spark and hopefully having the ability to kind of link that spark to resources and an opportunity. But very often it also involves risk-taking. And I think that's going to be potentially a theme that we'll address at least part in this panel. I want to start with David. We're going to maybe zoom out and then zoom in to specific themes and topics. But so much of the work of Opportunity Insights and Raj Chetty's scholarship really focuses on the importance of place to life chances. And I want you to talk a little bit about how and why place matters, and then we'll get into more details.
Definitely. So for a little bit of context, some of our more recent research looks at geography and the impact of geography on opportunity. And how we do that is using IRS records, tax records, and Census Bureau data, is looking at 20 million kids, or adults now, who were born in the 80s, linking them to their parents so we understand where they grew up and how much money their parents made when they were growing up, and then tracking their outcomes into adulthood. So looking at their earnings when they grow up. So it's able to help us better understand what we find to be a causal impact of those neighborhoods on those long-term outcomes of children. And we see, and we're able to understand that causal impact in part because we can actually look at folks who move between different communities. And we see that someone who started off growing up, or a family that started off in a high poverty neighborhood, a low opportunity place, then moved to a higher opportunity place, we actually see differences between those siblings who had different exposure to those places, right? So that younger sibling who received more exposure, so let's call it that higher opportunity place, on average has higher outcomes than their sibling who grew up in that same household. So it really points to not just that certain kinds of families move to certain kind of places, but place has a real impact, a causal impact on those outcomes. And what we see nationally is that in the Rust Belt and places like Cleveland and Detroit in the Southeast, we see much lower rates of mobility, right? So in places where low-income kids grow up in those regions, they tend on average to become low-income adults. Whereas in the Great Plains, the upper Midwest, you see sometimes on the coast, much higher rates of mobility, many times higher than any country we have data for, right? So kids who are growing up in low-income families are earning on average upwards of $30,000 and $40,000, very high rates of mobility. But what we find, which is most interesting, is that we see these regional differences, but we see that same range of outcomes within every community in the country as well. So we can look at it census tract by census tract, zip code by zip code, very different outcomes based on neighborhoods, even neighborhoods just a mile away from one another.
Talk to us a little bit about how you classify high opportunity. What are the components of a high opportunity place, and what distinguishes it from what you would call a low opportunity place?
So I think when you try and term neighborhoods, it can always be a little bit tricky. But what we do is that it's not based on if a place has a high poverty rate or a place looks a certain way demographically, but it really is based on the outcomes of the kids who grow up there. So in some sense, it's almost an objective measure of the impact that place has on the kids who grow up there. I think the deeper question is what's behind that, right? What causes these outcomes? You know, we don't know the exact mechanisms, but we can see certain things in the data. So one thing we see is that, not surprisingly, places that do have lower poverty rates oftentimes are higher opportunity places. One thing that I found interesting is that the factor we find most highly correlated with upward mobility are the share of two-parent households in that neighborhood, which I think speaks to issues of family and community stability. But one point that especially struck me was that for low-income Black men, regardless of their own family circumstance, regardless of if they had a father in their own household, we see in that neighborhoods that specifically have more Black fathers present, all the young Black men end up having better outcomes on average. So I think it speaks to beyond the things we typically associate with better or higher opportunity places, something about seeing people you can relate to, having mentors in your community. We see a tangible outcome on those kids who grow up in those places. So I think it can help us think more critically around, you know, not just school, not just those things we typically associate with creating opportunity, but really social capital, neighborhood cohesion, things that are a little harder to put your fingers on, but things that we see in the data have real concrete impact.
Thank you. So I'm gonna pivot a little bit to Martha, and it's interesting that you make the point about social connectedness, because in the earlier panel, you know, we were talking about job ladders and the volatility of low-wage workers, you know, and the tough time of re-entering after having had periods of instability. And I think one of the things, Martha, that you pointed out in some of your work on low-wage workers is sort of the potential impact from mentoring and early mentoring, the value of early job exposure and experience, and how that can actually be a mechanism to greater job prospects and life chances. So I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about your research, particularly on low-wage workers.
We just did an analysis looking at all workers ages 18 to 64, and our data source, since I know there are people in here who care about such things, our data source was the American Community Survey census data, pooling together the years of 2012 to 2016. And we looked at their hourly earnings. I will spare you the behind the curtain stuff. And we found that 53 million people in that age group, or 44% of all workers in that age group, are earning low wages. Median hourly wages were $10.22 an hour, and for those working full-time, full year, the median annual wages were about $24,000. So when you think about low-wage workers, a couple of stereotypes come to mind. One, it's students. Two, it's young people at the beginning of their careers. This is a springboard. Three, it's someone earning supplemental income, like who cares about an ESL teacher who is married to a lawyer? And I mean, in terms of their economic prospects. But what we found was that 2/3 of the workers in this group were between the ages of 25 to 54. And most of those workers in that group are working full-time, full year. That's not the pattern if you're just looking for some extra side money. And we found that half of all of the workers were either the sole earner in their family or were contributing substantially to family incomes. So if you want to think about who low-wage workers are, in terms of whether the job is a springboard or a dead end, what this data told me was that for a lot of people, it is a dead end if what you are looking at is you want to earn wages to support your family in a decent standard of living.
Thanks for that. And just to kind of level set, we're talking about 44% of American workers.
Yeah.
That's a lot. The views I express are my own. So when you look and you kind of unpack, I mean, you had a really beautiful, it's a beautiful report. I was so envious of the graphic designer. I want to steal them from Brookings. But when you look at the typology, what struck me was you had basically 9 types of folks who met different age categories and had different levels of educational attainment, but yet were low-wage earners. What was really striking is roughly 50% of these folks have some post-secondary education. They have touched, the earlier panel talked about the importance of education and how we need to do more. I want to pivot to Marisa to talk to us a little bit about the education issues that you're addressing, and specifically for folks who are currently low wage, who are trying to attain some post-secondary training education. How's that working for them? Because we heard there's a lot of student debt, and it's not getting paid down. So what's going on? Educate us.
Yeah. Can I just take a step back really quickly to speak a little bit to essentially the fact that students are graduating, unfortunately, without the social capital and the work-based learning experience that they need to get good paying jobs. And I think that's a key component that is lacking in a lot of state and local policies. Unfortunately, when we look at CUNY, right, it's a largely commuter school. Students work full-time or part-time jobs, multiple jobs to help them get through. And unfortunately, a lot of those jobs are the low wage, like retail jobs. And although they teach skills, it's not really tied to economic opportunity in the future. In addition to that, I think a lot of these students, many CUNY students, I believe over half of CUNY students, are first-generation college-going students. So they're learning to navigate this, but at the same time, they don't have a parent, a brother, a relative in their family that they can really lean to and help open the door and usher in information about different economic opportunities or really different careers. And so we are trying to work with Braven and some other organizations to really try to build and increase these opportunities within institutions. So I hope that kind of speaks a little bit to that. We can talk a little bit about debt, if you will. And so just at the federal level, I want to just note that the purchasing power of Pell has diminished quite considerably. I think back in 1975, it covered about 79%, right, of the cost of college. Now it's about 29%. What we're also seeing is the fact that although there are efforts across the state, for example, to help cover the cost of college for students, unfortunately, they don't address basic needs. And so students are taking out loans to help cover the high cost of living in New York, to pay for food, Metro cards, books, et cetera. I wanted to relate to reference just a quick statistic here that just about half of all New Yorkers ages 18 to 34 have student loan debt. And New York student borrowers owe a cumulative of $90 billion in student loans, just about the same size as the entire budget of New York City. And when we hone in a bit deeper, It's considerably lower than the national average, which is I think about 31,000. Here, it's about 5 to 10,000, and so I think that says a lot about what students, really need support in helping them get through college.
Quick follow-up for you. So
Sure.
we had a lot of questions following the first panel related to race and ethnicity. And I wanted to kind of reference a statistic related to duration of college experience and the finding that Black and Latino students are on average taking longer to attain, to complete their college course, and the strain that can put. So if the average is 6 years, is one statistic that I read. Could you talk to us a little bit about the impact, and then also some recommendations? The Young Invincibles has a policy program, and you have a platform. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So to address the longer time, so typically. And this is now in terms of data, right? Colleges are measuring college completion not only at the 4-year level, but to truly reflect graduation rates at the 6-year level as well. It's no surprise that students are taking longer to get into college. I think some of the main barriers at the onset are the need for remediation, right? And that can delay college. In addition to that, it's really about helping cover the costs and having to, I think, really work to make it through. So we're seeing more students go to college at part-time as well. So there are efforts by the state. I mean, we see the Excelsior Scholarship. Personally speaking, I'm not a fan. There are strict restrictions related to it. And the fact of the matter is that if students default on any of those regulations, that scholarship actually turns into a loan. And for working students, this is especially hard. I mean, they're required to take 30 credits per year, maintain a GPA, and they have to also work for the number of years that it took for them to get the degree, which is essentially 4 to 5 years. I think they've just loosened up the regulation for that. And that can be an opportunity cost as well, given the fact that they may get a better job offer, for example, in California or whatever it might be. So,
just a quick clarification. You referenced remediation.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a couple of puzzled looks in the audience. Could you just clarify what you mean by remediation?
Oh, sure. So typically when students enter college, there is a core curriculum that you're assigned to take. For example, English Literature 101 or Math 101. However, students, at least in New York City, that don't score a certain level, like on their Regents, for example, have to take a precursor course, and they have to pay out of pocket for that before they can enter into that basic core curriculum class. So that's already a huge challenge and a barrier to persistence, right?
Thanks. So I'm going to swing back to David. And, linking back to high opportunity places that you all have found and places that are, for whatever special sauce, if it's, social networks and density of opportunity, I'm curious about one of the policy solutions that you've proposed, and you've done some experimentation in Seattle with housing vouchers. And offering a broader set of opportunities for families to relocate. Talk to us a little bit about the inspiration for that, the insight that drove that experiment, where it stands now, and whether you see this as sort of a potentially scalable solution.
Definitely. So when you're able to use the data, when you can pinpoint where these places are within communities where when low-income kids grow up there, they have better outcomes. I think one intuitive question is, well, how do you break down the barriers of access to those places? And when some of the research came out a few years ago, the research team started to have conversations with housing authorities who are saying, hey, there's this history of thinking around how we can more effectively use things like housing choice vouchers. And a question kind of in the industry was almost, are people living in certain places because of choice, or is it more because of barriers in the housing market? Plus, now that we have this research that shows that more clearly defines the impact of neighborhoods, if it is about barriers, how do we support families when they're making moves, when they're thinking about where they want to live, to perhaps increase the opportunity they have in the housing market in general? So we ran a pilot project, a randomized evaluation last year, where we provided a suite of services to families who are coming off the housing choice voucher waitlist. So it included a housing navigator, someone to help them through the rental search process. We engaged with landlords, and we also provided flexible financial assistance for things like moving expenses and security deposits. And so what we saw was that, and part of that housing counseling was information around these higher opportunity places again that we see in the data have better outcomes for low-income kids. And what we saw in the evaluation was for those families that didn't receive the extra services, that received the voucher, but kind of got business as usual with the housing authority, about 10% or 15% of those families ended up moving to these higher opportunity places. But the families who received those services, received that counseling, or be engaged with landlords, they were almost 4 times more likely to move to these higher opportunity neighborhoods. And these are places where we see in the data, we estimate that over a lifetime, kids who grow up there will be more likely to attend college, less likely to be incarcerated, and will probably earn around $200,000 more over their lifetime. That's again what we see in the data. So again, right, this isn't the only solution, right? But I think thinking about histories of housing discrimination and redlining, right, I think this is one tool in the toolbox to help kind of pull back or kind of fix some of the issues of segregation that I think have gotten us to these kind of downward trends in mobility in the first place. And I think what's also exciting for us is that I think seeing the research base, actually having a successful pilot program, we're now seeing some federal movement, right? So a new bill was introduced last year that would create 500,000 new vouchers and also be accompanied with these same types of mobility services. So, right, I mean, like HUD spends billions of dollars every year on housing choice vouchers, and I think this is a way to potentially make a program like that more effective and actually creating upward mobility for those families who receive that benefit.
So you kind of touched on something where I was going, which was, one, how scalable is a solution like this? Two, the tension between short-term solutions and then longer-term multi-generational fixes. And I guess, so I've got a 2-part question. I'm going to let you address the first part, and then I'm going to come back. The first is, how scalable is this from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think in a sense it's very scalable. And I think it's not just about moving people, but it's about how do we actually create more integrated communities. So I think housing choice vouchers are one tool, affordable housing policy, things like the low-income housing tax credit, even things like zoning reform, right? Zoning mechanisms in cities that have kept out low-income families and families of color from certain places for a very long time. Like, how do we just create more opportunities and more kind of opportunity for families to live where they want to live, right? I think most people in this room, I think our parents probably moved to a place that they thought would be good for us. A lot of families don't have that same choice. So I think in some sense, that's a first step, right? I think families should be empowered to make the best choice on behalf of themselves and their children. And I think housing choice vouchers, affordable housing policy, I think are steps in that direction. But then I think, again, there's, how do we then invest in all places to make them higher opportunity places as well?
Okay, so I'm going there. What, in your view, I mean, there are multiple components, right? And we could all hypothesize what's part of that secret formula that makes some places more conducive to economic mobility than others. Whether it is the presence of 2-parent households, whether it is, I'm thinking about Robert Putnam and broader social capital, a history of good schools, and so forth. If you had to pick kind of where you would put the biggest policy impetus, is it housing policy, because stability of housing can really be an anchor for families. Where would you put your emphasis for those longer term kind of turnaround type of investments?
So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to pick 3 things. Okay. I'm going to pick 3 things. So I think housing policy is extremely important in the sense of, I think we don't see a lot of great outcomes in places where there is concentrated poverty. Right? So I think housing policy is the most concrete mechanism to really attack that issue. But then I think 2 is this more nebulous issue of neighborhood cohesion and social capital. Right? So what are creative ways that when we're actually creating more kind of physical mixture, how do we create connections, friendships, networks between families that look different? And I think that's the thing that we don't have the answer for, but I think there's probably a lot of people doing a lot of great grassroots work that we should be learning from and experimenting with, and then really building that evidence base for all of that kind of work to understand what really works and has these impacts that I think we all care about. I think third is the issue of race, which we really can't get around. I think oftentimes we assume, and we assume correctly, that because African-American families oftentimes are coming from low-income households, they're gonna have worse outcomes because of that low-income starting point. But what we see is that even for high-income families, right? So black men who grow up in high-income families, they're actually more likely to become low-income adults when they grow up. And even in the same neighborhoods, right, black and white men who grow up on the same block, in the same neighborhoods, have very different outcomes. So I think it really speaks to, in early childhood, adolescence, before college, how is race and racism impacting black men specifically at every level? Because interestingly, one thing we see is conditional on income, black women and white women actually have very similar outcomes. So I think kind of the way that race impacts opportunity is kind of ever present, and I think something that we really need to be looking at in all the kinds of programs and policies that we're working on.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot to Martha here. I really appreciate that, and we're going to come back to all of what you said. Martha, when you talk about low-wage workers, and you talk about, I want to go back to the finding about participation in some form of higher education for roughly half of these workers. Can you talk to us? Jason, I think, very astutely pointed out the potential for community colleges. Can you talk to us a little bit about community colleges as a bridge, and how well are they working, and where do you see kind of best examples of community colleges that really are bridges to good jobs? What can we learn from them?
Community colleges are a linchpin of our higher education system. There are about 1,100 of them around the country, and we ask a lot of them. They are designed to provide 2-year transfer degrees for people who want to go and transfer to get a bachelor's degree. They provide applied associate's degrees in technical trades, and then they also do short-term job training and a lot of community outreach. And meanwhile, they are also one of the least resourced parts of our higher ed system, even as they are taking a lot of students who need remediation. So I think community colleges are a part of the answer. I think we have to think bigger about their financing and mission if we want to get beyond excellent boutique programs, or schools that have a charismatic leader, or like a state legislature that has a state system that is very organized and cohesive. So in general, there are great examples of community colleges working with the sector as a whole, and sometimes within that with particular employers. I was visiting Tennessee, and there are some community colleges that look like the manufacturing floor of an automobile manufacturing plant. They have the same equipment that was donated. Their instructors talk to the people at the plant, like it's very well integrated, or Northern Virginia Community College near where I live has an amazing health training wing or building with, dummies for people training to be EMTs that are like $120,000 a piece, so that you can actually practice doing I don't know, the things that you do when you're an EMT in a realistic manner. So, there are so many possibilities, but we have to organize ourselves to do it.
So you also point out some really, I think, interesting, demographic trends, right, or demographic observations about low-wage workers. And one thing is that they are disproportionately female. The second thing is that they're disproportionately Latinx and African American. And you also point out that 40% of them are raising children. So can you talk to us a little bit about kind of specific policy ideas that you have? Because we know a couple of things. Just to recap for folks, this is sort of, I always think of like 3 o'clock to 4:30 as nap time. I've never graduated, maybe from kindergarten. But so for those who may have checked out for a second, we know a couple things about this population. We know that there are 44% of American workers, and we know that a lot of them have tried to get higher educational attainment of one sort or another, and they may have some debt that's really tough to pay off if they haven't gotten the degree. So talk to us a little bit about kind of where your head is at, having studied these folks and understood the challenges, the real challenges that they're facing.
I could speak for a while on this. One major issue is childcare. If we had quality, affordable childcare, that would be amazing. It is so hard to pay childcare fees, even as a white-collar professional. Like, it's just, you're just like, oh, is this like NYU tuition? Oh my God. And the lack of it is just, it's a threshold barrier. It is threshold. And there are programs, they're called two-generation programs, that are linking together this idea of job training and early childhood education, which is a great idea. I mean, in some cases they're linked thematically, but we also don't need to have them linked. We just need really good, affordable childcare. And then in other issues, I think I'm working with a colleague, Molly Kinder, and we're sort of thinking about different phases of the life cycle. And for those who are age 18 to 24, it's sort of either a zone of derailment, but also a zone of promise. And if they have fallen off track towards an educational credential or an apprenticeship program, then that is really the time to try to get them back. You know, like double down on the outreach, double down on programs that can reach young people who are some of them are really alienated. There was one program that works with young people that talked about, you know, wrapping them in a bear hug of supports. And, you know, in the world of policy, that can feel like, what? We're going to put bear hug in our policy guidance? But really, it's ensuring that there's a caring adult who is there for that person. And then for this other age group, like the 25 to 50-year-old, we're calling them like in the thick of it. Like, if you have kids, the thought of adding school on to your day just seems crazy. And the idea that you can just go online and take a class and get some kind of credential right away is not realistic. So we have to rethink how we reach that population of people.
David's got some questions.
Well, thanks, Claire. And I just wanted to jump in because it seemed like the appropriate time, because in the audience, several, we're really happy you went to these ideas about solutions. Lots of questions around solutions, right? So someone from the audience mentioned Paul Quinn College. And so there's at least 10 questions around, can you just name some examples that are working? Just programmed, you know, just kind of rapid fire. Another group of questions has really kind of highlighted on this idea that we've been discussing opportunity inequality that varies over space, but much less, and how it varies over time. Are there places that have improved economic mobility opportunity over time? So in that opportunity bucket. And then they're the sort of the pessimists on this group saying, well, okay, be careful what you do, right? Because if, for example, you provided vouchers and relocate half the neighborhood, what happens to the other half, right? And also this idea Jason brought up last time, economic growth, the things that can kind of bring wealth to a place can actually also contribute to its economic inequality. What are we thinking about gentrification, displacement strategies, things like that, if we're successful? So that was a group there. This last one I couldn't pass up, which was about, I think there's some followers of Amartya Sen in the group, and just wondering, are we measuring the right things? Are there other elements of this? Maybe it's a low opportunity neighborhood in some respects, but it is high in social cohesion and satisfaction, and I don't know if someone wants to tackle that.
All right, that's a lot. Okay, so let's start with specific examples because I think that's important. So maybe we'll just do a rapid fire. You all have alluded to some solutions, but I think let's go there first.
Maybe so I'll start with kind of thinking about vouchers as one possible example, some of the drawbacks, some of the pros. It was interesting, so in Boston, the Boston Housing Authority has some similar programs where they're increasing the amount that a person with a voucher can pay for rent, so they can potentially move to more expensive places, which is in some ways kind of a similar idea to moving to higher opportunity places. But interestingly, they frame it in two ways. So they frame it as an opportunity for families if they want to move out to the suburbs because they feel like that's the best place for their family, great. But also, Boston has been changing very rapidly as well, and rents are going up. So they actually see it as an anti-gentrification or displacement strategy. So those families who live in Dorchester or Roxbury or places where they've been for generations, but rents are going up, that actually helps them stay in that neighborhood as well. And I think that's what's at the core of it, right? Is that it gives more choice. It's not saying you should move somewhere else, but saying, here's information. Now you make the best informed choice for yourself. And so I think so it's not about moving people to places that we deem better. I think it's giving families more information and more opportunity to make that choice. But I do think, though, that it needs to be paired with thinking more critically around how we invest in places that have been disinvested in for the past half century, which I think is a more complicated issue. I think in some sense, I would like to be able to give bear hugs to neighborhoods, right? So saying, what are the comprehensive set of supports? How do we buffer the K through 12 systems through extracurricular activities, mentorship programs, early ed programs? Because I think what we see is that every year of exposure matters. So I think it means that we need to really create holistic, comprehensive supports in places that haven't had them traditionally.
I mean, it's interesting because you have experience in Detroit, and somebody has just asked this question about trajectories of places that were, doing quite well and then met a demise, and now Detroit has had a lot of investment. Can you talk about that, the cycle of cross-time variation in a place, and how you kind of think about revitalization, because you've been on the front line of that?
Yeah, no, so Detroit's an interesting case because it was almost the mecca of the black middle class. It helped build the black middle class, but given global trends, racism, white flight, middle class black flight, most neighborhoods in Detroit are very high poverty. But it's interesting though, so Detroit is probably the one place that literally has enough space for everyone, right? So I mean, there are tens of thousands of vacant homes. I think, part of our goal was to move back in more middle class families to create more of a tax base, but more income diversity. But even then, you still have the fear of displacement and gentrification. And I think in many ways, it's not necessarily about physical displacement, but just as we're seeing, if you've been in a place that's been on the decline for 10, 20, 30 years, you've been promised things for that entire time, but it hasn't come true. Now you're seeing new development. You're seeing hipsters move in, empty nesters move in, new development downtown. Even if that isn't displacing you or hurting you, you probably aren't benefiting from it as much as other people are. And so I think there's a dissonance there that is hard to, that was kind of my job, was to help facilitate those conversations. So I think there's a lot of work to go on issues like displacement and gentrification as we're trying to create more mixed income communities. But I think hopefully if we actually have a better understanding with data of what's actually happening and the real risk, that can at least help facilitate a more constructive conversation and not just fears on both sides of the issue.
There's also, an element here, I mean, dare I say it, we are apolitical. We are an apolitical organization, but there is political will, and there's consensus building and coalition building that's absolutely necessary. There's also, we've talked about racism, we've talked about, attitudes of the public. And so, I'm thinking about, the maps, when you look at opportunity maps, and then you look at segregation policy in America, the South just screams. The South screams. And, when I look at the major metro areas that Professor Chetty has studied, in terms of mobility, Charlotte was one of the lowest mobility places. And yet Charlotte has embarked on a partnership with you all and is really taking stock of, the low mobility, the low economic mobility that its residents are encountering. Can you talk to us just really briefly about what's going on in Charlotte and kind of what's behind that, and if you see that as sort of a promising, maybe disruptor in some way?
No, so I think it speaks to what some folks on the previous panel were talking about also, is that issue of human capital development. Because what we see in the data is that places like Charlotte, places like Atlanta, that have been in some sense tremendous success stories, right, that have seen incredible growth over the past 10, 20, 30 years, still somehow are these lower mobility places. And what we see from conversations down there is that they've been importing talent, right? So they let other communities develop that human capital, and then those residents move to Charlotte for the jobs at Bank of America and at Wells Fargo. So I think because of that dissonance, Charlotte community leaders found it surprising that they were so low on our metric. But I think instead of saying, that isn't how we want to measure opportunity, we don't care about Dr. Chetty's work, they used it as a call to action. So they said, there's a lot of great things happening here, but we want to be a high opportunity place and a high growth place. So let's double down and really think through what levers can we pull to reverse this trend locally. So over the past few years, they had a annual $12 million affordable housing bond. They kicked it up to $50 million. They just raised, I think, 10 or 20 million for additional rental subsidy programs, and they're moving towards universal pre-K. So I think it's a community that has been able to galvanize using these data points to really put money behind evidence-based practices that we think will actually, in the long run, increase opportunity there through that human capital development that we do see is so crucial.
Thanks, and that also speaks to kind of that long-term trajectory, right? Long-term investments. So thank you for that specific example. Marisa, I'm going to turn to you for your specific example of what's promising and what's working.
Sure. So when we look at CUNY ASAP is a program that has been really proven effective. It has doubled graduation rates and is now being replicated in Ohio, in Michigan, and in Westchester. This program, it stands for Associated Study in Associate Program, or Applied Study in Associates Program. And essentially what it does is it covers the cost of tuition, as well as the costs of books, Metro cards. Students also get additional academic advising and counseling. So essentially they have the above tuition costs covered, as well as the wraparound supports to help them through. That program is funded largely by the mayor's office and by, I think, the Jewish Foundation for the Education of Women. It does not have a huge investment, if any, from the state. And so this is a great example, right, of something I think that can be replicated across SUNY and perhaps even other campuses. What's happening now within CUNY is that they are piloting a 4-year program called ACE that's very similar to ASAP. John Jay, I think, is now in its 5th year of that program. I believe, again, they've seen tremendous graduation rates, I believe within 5 years. And I think they've graduated about 800 or 900 students. This year was the first cohort at Lehman College of about 250 students. So that is a best practice, and that is something that we would like to see the state really invest in. It works. I think a longer term, what we're looking to do is, and we've already started partnering with organizations, is to try to establish a state attainment goal for college graduation. And we really want to look at disaggregated data and have goals by different groups as well. And so we've started taking a look at effective efforts in different states. And so this is laying the foundation year for us to help push advocacy efforts forward in the future.
Thanks, and I'm going to turn it over to Martha.
In addition to CUNY ASAP, there's a number of what are called sector-based workforce development programs, which the idea is that the job training program develops deep, strong relationships with local employers, usually focused on a particular industry, and become known as trusted providers of a great talent pool. And they usually also provide some kind of above average level of advising and supportive services. One caveat, though, is that they often require the participants to have at least a 10th grade reading level, which doesn't sound like it is a barrier, but it is a barrier. And then for young people, there are a number of options. There's a program called Year Up, which probably many of you know about, works with 18 to 24-year-olds. Another program called Youth Build that works with 18 to 24-year-olds. And what I see in common with them is that they have high expectations and high support for their participants. The ingredients between these two programs differ, but it's generally a mix of academic skills, work readiness skills, and some technical specific occupational skills.
I'm just curious, for both Marisa and Martha on that front, what are we talking about in terms of the funding for the wraparound program? So how many students are you reaching, and what's the cost? Again, with the mind toward replication and scalability, if this is proving to be successful.
I believe for CUNY ASAP, it's about $3,000 investment per student per year. On top of like the cost of tuition. So I don't have like the total number with me, but I can certainly send it to you. We can maybe send it out. But relatively, this is like a low, I think, in terms of the grand scale of like investments in higher education. This isn't a huge investment, I think. I think this is something that is can be attainable for the city and the state.
Well, it also depends on the metric you use. If you look at the cost per degree achieved, CUNY ASAP is cheaper than just cost per student. For some of these, I mean, they are expensive, especially, for instance, like with Youth Build and Year Up that combine wage-paying jobs or internships that you have to cover the wages as part of it. It could be $20,000 a year, which, we have no system that is ready to spend $20,000 a year on someone after you're done with K through 12. I mean, even during K through 12, the per pupil funding formula is probably not $20,000, but the funding sources just dry up.
On the other hand, I mean, we can make assumptions about, indebtedness. You can make assumptions about other kind of longer-term support that you would need throughout a lifespan, and then, multiple generations in terms of affordable housing support and other wraparound services. So, I haven't done the model. I'm not the person to do the model, but that is just, you can kind of think about those parameters and do some interesting estimates. I know that we don't have a ton of time. David, have we gotten a second batch of questions, or do I have the microphone owner's prerogative? Okay, great. So I will run with that. Okay, so I want to ask a big question, which is we've talked about or framed this in terms of life chances and broadening access to life chances. I want to ask you, in your view, your best estimate, how optimistic are you about the ability of young Americans to live the American dream? There have been some really interesting stats on this. The probability of earning more than your parents has gone down to about 50%. And there's been a lot of literature on that. But given what you know and given your ideas about potential policy levers, what are your thoughts on this, David?
Want the optimistic or pessimistic versions of this answer?
I mean, Raj Teddy is an optimist, but you can depart from that. We're not going to hold you to it.
So I think, kind of a similar stat to looking at kind of long-term trends in mobility is looking across countries. So, we looked at, what are the chances that a low-income kid grows up to become a high-income adult. So kind of going from the lowest quintile, the lowest 20%, to the top 20% of the income distribution. And so in the US, it's around 7%, right? So that kind of pick yourself up by the bootstraps narrative, 7% chance in America. So I was raised in Detroit, worked there. My office, I oversaw, I could oversee Canada. So I would see the Detroit River, I could look and see the Canadian flag waving, right? And in Canada, that same metric, I think it's almost double what it is in the US, right? So I think there are many reasons to kind of be worried about these trends, especially looking at outcomes for minority groups, for Black men specifically. But when you see there's an example of a country that looks pretty similar, obviously, like invests in very different ways, but I think having a real example of a place where these rates are much higher shows that there are pathways forward. Right? It'll actually take money, right? It'll take political will. I think it's almost an interesting exercise to not just calculate how much these programs cost, but think about, for people in the room, like a middle-class family, upper middle-class family, how much do you invest in your kids per year, right? Like, it's probably more than $3,000, right? So when we're thinking around inequality, if a low-income kid is competing with their middle-income or high-income peers, if we're not willing to invest in them in the same way, how do we think they'll be able to compete and have these kind of outcomes that we want for them in adulthood? So I think there are examples of this being able to actually work, and it's a question of political will, which I think in some ways, given some of our political dynamics right now, make me a bit pessimistic, but I think there is a pathway forward if we're willing to actually work towards it.
Thanks. And of course, policy happens at a variety of levels. We haven't even gotten today into the complexities of what's happening. We've touched on city policies. We've touched on state level. But of course, there are differences across federal, state, and local. And so you're going to see innovation, I think, and the propensity to fund differ across those places. So that's for another day. Marisa, I'm going to turn to you.
Sure. I'd like to be optimistic here. It's a little tough given the political climate. But, we do know, unfortunately, that young adults today are faring worse. And we also have to think about really, how are we measuring success here in terms of outcomes? And for me, that is looking at the equity lens and across races, and that is to help ensure that all young adults, right, have access to opportunity. Unfortunately, right, we have to invest and work a little bit harder to make that happen. So, I think honing in a little bit more, right, we know that currently young white adults enjoy net wealth 10 times higher than young African Americans. We also know that young whites own homes at twice the rate of African Americans and Latinos. And so these are things that we hope within the next 5 to 10 years that we can at least increase those rates across all, but especially for those that are lower.
And everything that we've talked about today indicates that education really is a key lever for that. Martha, over to you.
I don't like the odds right now. I would not want to be. If you think about, would you want someone to be? If you had to pick anyone just randomly from the whole demographic landscape, I think if you get a young person who has had stable housing and safe neighborhoods, and they are prepared to go to a somewhat selective school, then it's going to work for them. That's a minority. So I see a couple big buckets of things to address. One is the racism that just allows us to sets a baseline acceptance level of inferior conditions across domains for people based on the color of their skin. An education system that is riddled with inequities. So I would say there's people on those two problems. They're huge and daunting. The big problem that I worry about that I don't think we're on yet sufficiently is the question of the kinds of jobs that we are creating and what they are paying. because in order to find a good job, there is not only the worker and their skills and attitude and credentials, but there's also the available jobs, what the employers are looking for, what they expect, what they pay. And one of the things the 44% figure pointed out for me and led me to read some other stuff, some of which by your Federal Reserve colleagues, was just what are the jobs that are out there? And are there enough decent jobs for people who do not have a bachelor's degree? And the answer is there are not. There are not enough. So the question of how to support, what kind of incentives, regulations, supports can move this economy into the direction of creating better jobs is, I think, a central challenge.
I think it's a key challenge, which we're not going to solve in the next 3 minutes. But I want to conclude not on a negative note. I want to conclude on a big think note. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just really rapid fire, like 1 minute max. Talk to us a little bit about a policy idea that is either, just really in its early stages of thinking. Maybe it's a pilot that you've talked to colleagues about. But the thing that's so most exciting to you, the newest idea that is most exciting to you that could have an impact, a transformative impact on reducing inequality.
All right. So I think similar to the importance of neighborhoods, something we're starting to see in the research that we've already touched on is social capital, but even more so kind of friendship networks and relationship networks and how those can also be real drivers of economic opportunity. So there's a lot of work to go there, but I think we've been working on this, and I think there can be really creative ways, and I think this really is important to the place-based conversation. So if we can leverage housing policy effectively to create more integrated communities, what are those creative ways that in schools, through neighborhood organizations, we can actually create real relationships and friendships across lines of race and class? I think that could, almost even in unexpected ways, be a real driver of economic mobility. And one quick note, on a positive note too, I think seeing an example like Charlotte, so again, I'm not an economist by trade, big data isn't the only answer, but I think with the work that so many folks have been doing, it's much harder to hide the problem. And I think when we're able to really show disparate outcomes, it makes it harder to ignore them in the political conversation. And that does give me hope that we can use research and data to actually push these conversations forward. We know things that work. If we're willing to get behind them, I think we can actually see real difference.
Just quickly, one exciting idea is SUNY has now started a cohort-based model to help transfer students succeed. So to help them with the transfer process from 2 to 4 year colleges. It's a cohort-based model and it's by industry or interest. And so that is promising. It's just kind of in its first couple of years to launch. So we're currently learning more about that. I think just one other one that I wanted to add as a best practice is that, across CUNY community colleges, there are food pantries. And the governor invested a couple years in those, and we hope to see that investment sustained. But a best practice is having a nonprofit called Single Stop inside of those. And so when students come in for food, they're actually assessed for additional benefits to see if they qualify and then thus enrolled. And so this can really help alleviate some of those above tuition costs that we just spoke about in basic needs.
I am really interested in efforts that are happening in different places to sort of marry job quality, worker training, and firm productivity and together so that you are, I think the most concrete example of this comes from the work of the manufacturing extension programs, which work with small and mid-sized manufacturing companies on a variety of things. But there's been some new research that came out of the Aspen Institute that, it's like 20 companies, it's just beginning. But what they found were real improvements in job quality for the workers, safer conditions, more upward mobility, and more profitability and more efficiency for the company. So if there's some if we can rethink the assumptions underneath our business models, then I think we can rethink the kinds of jobs that we are creating.
Thank you. I want to just, David, over to you.
I'm going to ask you just to all stay put here for just 1 second because we're going to wrap up. And we're going to thank the panel in 1 minute. But I was just going to say, when I was a younger person, I would fly on airplanes, and they had, you didn't have like tablets and whatever, right? They showed one movie, right? And I was a poor person, and so I did not afford, it was like $1 to get the headphones, but I would not get the headphones, so I'd read my book. And it would get to a funny part of the movie, and the whole plane would start laughing, you know, would erupt in laughter and whatnot. It's a very weird experience because you're in this whole group of people, and it's like there's this whole experience that they're having that you're not perceiving, right? And I just want to remind you that you, as a group, as an audience, were at turns angry. I was clear in some of your Slido recommendations. There were a lot of questions around mass incarceration, for example. We did not get to that. You were also very happy at points in time. This, by the way, is my favorite one. So glad to see the Fed take on this important topic. Thank you. So you can put more of those in if you want. But please, what we weren't able to capture was the richness of your comments and your responses to the panel. We know that if we don't understand the problem successfully and deeply and with intellectual honesty, we're not going to be able to come up and put together the solutions and the business models and the policies and the practices that can alleviate the problem. And so we need you to be in conversation with us. A lot of this is about relationships. A lot of this is about getting to know each other, having the conversations, asking someone to slightly tweak the question they're asking so they get to better answers. And so please stay with us. For the next half hour or hour or so, we're going to have the reception on the other side of the building. And with that, please join me in thanking our last panel, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.